Hallo, hallo.
Sollte gehen. Okay, good morning, everyone. Glad to see so many of you here at 9 o'clock again. We are only starting 10 minutes late. And we are really going to dive into the theoretical aspects of thinking democracy and also social contracts later today in the Anthropocene Today. And it's my pleasure to announce our keynote speaker, Elisa Randazzo, who is associate professor at STEEP. And I learned that this is science, technology, engineering, and public policy at University College London. And her talk is on Beyond Hope, Temporality, and Wonder at the End of the World. And the floor is yours.
Thanks, Claudia. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for everyone who's in this room who had the heart to wake up early and show up at 9. I appreciate it. Thank you, Claudia, and thank you to the team as well for arranging everything logistically and making sure everything went smoothly in the past couple of days. Before I start, I'll make a couple of disclaimers. This won't be funny. So sorry, Petteri, sorry to disappoint. It won't be funny. So there won't be jokes. It starts well, it won't be funny. I will also apologize for sending in the wrong title for the keynote. I should have checked. But the good thing is I kept the punchline for the morning off. So I'm going to be talking about wonder, not hope twice, as it was actually in the title. Another warning, this is a very much work in progress. This is something I've presented kind of at the European ISA this year, but I've been working on it since, so I'll kind of, some of you in the room might have heard some of it, but I'll kind of go deeper with a bit more time. Another warning, if I may, there may be occasional profanity. This is not me trying to keep it interesting, I'm just quoting from things. So if, ahead of the occasional F-bomb, I will warn you. And also another warning, I don't usually use slides, so I apologize for the slides being incredibly dry, but I thought since you made the effort of being here at 9 in the morning, I might just give you something to look at, just in case you feel like I'm putting you to sleep. So now that I've successfully, I hope, lowered your expectations enough of what's about to happen, let me actually start. So that doesn't work. That doesn't work. Let me try like this. Did that work? No, it's not working. Nobody knows what I'm doing. Oh, yeah. Hallelujah. Okay. Should have warned you. There is a quote. I promise you it's the first and only quote that will be there, but it's a long one, and I'd like to start with it because I think it's quite a good place to start. We're living through a crisis of meaning. This is not in the quote, but the quote follows this insight. Sitting in his rooms in Cambridge, the late 19th century philosopher Henry Sidgwick could read about famine in Bengal, but there was little he could do about it in real time except to decry it. You, on the other hand, can immediately empty your bank account and make something happen on the ground in a disaster zone. Maybe save some lives, maybe increase the opportunities for corruption. Or instead, you could go in for some online gambling on your children's future. Or you could just leave everything to your canary. Everything seems possible, but nothing seems to matter. Nothing seems certain or to matter. With this insight, novelist Bonnie Natzam and philosopher Dale Jamieson frame the context for what is a very ambitious transdisciplinary book called Love in the Anthropocene. I don't know if you've read it. If you have, you may recall this from the introduction. The book is a series of short stories set in an ambiguous timeline that could be 200 years from now, it could be 2 years from now, it could be 2 months from now, it could be 2 days from now. Who knows? For them, just like for countless other scholars, many of whom are in this room, coming from all sorts of corners from the disciplinary horizon, we're not just living through an environmental crisis when we're talking about the Anthropocene, we're living through a crisis of meaning. This is what I heard yesterday as well. So in a way, it's good that I'm talking after a lot of you have already made that point. The interconnectedness and technological advances that characterize the Anthropocene, and for which the environment and plenty of populations worldwide have paid an incommensurable price, now show us not only the ultimate failure of the Enlightenment and its purpose, what everybody is referring to as the crisis of liberalism, but point us to a much more disturbing paradox, that whilst globalization, interconnection, technological advances have changed the way we do things, they've changed our agency, they have changed the way we think or what we think is possible, we are at heart profoundly hollowed out by a sense of hopelessness, particularly when it comes to doing things or stopping things, or for instance, stemming climate change or coping with other systemic and often irreversible transformations. Whilst on the one hand, we bring about these changes, we hasten globalization, we strengthen interconnection, we improve our technology, they note we lose the sense of responsibility and belief in our own ability to actually make change happen. That which was so central to Enlightenment, the idea that we can make things better. Nadzam and Jameson's collection of vignettes offer dystopian near futures or distant presents, and go on to reimagine how rethinking care and love in the Anthropocene might reanimate a sense of agency. Okay, might tell us how to do things in this time. In the novel, the Anthropocene is not just a major meta-level rupture, but can be seen as operating a number of simultaneous ruptures, a sort of visible through a number of different fault lines in private relationships, in politics, in governance structures, in techno-social assemblages. What I'll do in the next minutes, I'm not going to say how long, hopefully I'll stick to time, maybe 40 minutes, maybe less, is to start unpacking this assumption, that is that the Anthropocene has killed our certainties through a series of ruptures. If you're familiar with Anthropocene literature, which I'm sure you are, you'll see rupture described in lots of different ways, from visible things in our Earth systems, changes in relationships to our natural environment, and in the way we view the role of the human. The list of what is fundamentally different, irreversibly changed in the Anthropocene is lengthy, and these lists are complicated by the positionality of those who compile them. Okay, they come from all over the world, you know, scholars from the global north, the global south, and so on. But at their core, they acknowledge that to affirm that we live in the Anthropocene is to affirm the death of the modernist project or the modernist fantasy of progress and enlightenment. And this is what I heard yesterday as well. You may correct me if I'm wrong. These Anthropocene affirmations populate diverse disciplines in the humanities and the natural sciences, and they come together to dispel the certainties that have enabled humankind to exploit, extract, subjugate, and violate its way to the top of a self-imposed hierarchy. In the novel that I've just mentioned just now, love endures in the face of crumbling modernity in unexpected ways, even if it coexists with this deep sense of hopelessness in our own capacity to make change happen. The ruins of modernity in the book are a fact. They are a literary tool that serve as a background for reanimating the main character, love, the agency, the power of love, effectively. Never thought I'd say the power of love in a keynote, but here we go. In social theories, on the other hand, the critique of modernity, that is how we get to the ruins and the ruins themselves, is a necessary process to reveal the complexity of the world. The ruins are in some ways the protagonist rather than the background, rather than the backdrop of the novel. In these theories, critique plays a variety of important roles, such as opening up to radically different onto epistemologies, like the ones that are contained in indigenous cosmologies and other marginalized onto epistemologies. Like in the novel, theoretical approaches to the Anthropocene share a concern for what's possible after the end of certainty, or as D.A. says, what to do after having done. Okay, I think some of you have already touched on this yesterday as well. The novel centers this crisis of meaning and the hopelessness that characterizes it as the starting point to reanimate agency and think about the possibilities after having done. What I want to do next is to address this starting point, so the condition of hopelessness that we're in the Anthropocene, and how it affects our political and practical possibilities, and then move on to think about how else we can think about or theorize possibility in the Anthropocene. And I will say that wonder might be a way to think about it. Perhaps not the only way, but might be a way. I want to suggest that particular discourses of hopelessness reproduce binaries that critiques of modernity want to dismantle. And instead, I want to explore how changing our attention towards concepts like temporality, Igor, I'm looking at you, and wonder might offer politically and theoretically productive pathways to thinking beyond binaries. In doing so, what I want to do today is to ask what lies beyond the horizon of hope in the Anthropocene, and how wonder as a mode of worlding might help us imagine politics, imagine the real, at a time when certainty has been said to have collapsed under the ultimate weight of the rupture with modernity. You don't have to look at the slides, but if you get lost, they're there. So I'm not going to go into what the Anthropocene is. You are very familiar with this, with it, but I will kind of tease out why it's important to sort of remind us of why it's such a meaningful concept. The Anthropocene is not just the tag that was given to a geologic epoch. Okay, it's a conceptual earthquake. It's introduced as something that unsettles not just the fantasy, the modernist fantasy of progress and mastery and control over the world, but every single category we've thought about that has come to kind of compound to that definition of progress, modernist progress. For politics and international relations, which is my field, this is a seismic thing. The Anthropocene is literally a seismic thing. Sovereignty, security, governance, all of which are built on assumptions of human exceptionalism and linear progress, come under fire when the realities of the Anthropocene reveal to us the limits of what can be done over the world, of mastery over the world. Looking beyond the modernist framing of the world then becomes both necessary to acknowledge and recognize the fact that the world is already complex and has always been complex, but is also a normative endeavor to explore radically alternative possibilities, often experienced by those who operate on different onto epistemological parameters to those of liberal modernity, i.e. read the turn towards indigenous communities. This engagement with otherwise realities is often coupled with anti-capitalist decolonial thinking, seeking to draw attention to marginalized realities, but also to stress the origins of the Anthropocene condition itself back to extractive racial capitalism. Okay, there's a normative element here to critiquing the Anthropocene, which we can't, critiquing the sort of the basis of the Anthropocene, which we shouldn't be dismissing. The endeavor of looking for otherwise realities is as much about radical politics in the present as it is about imagining the future and imagining what is possible and what remains possible in the ruins of the Anthropocene, in the aftermath of the death of certainty. Much of this debate has already taken place, and it's taken place in various different registers. The register I want to pick on at the moment today is that of hope. So the debate that's centered around hope. And many of you in this room have touched upon issues to do with hope. Some of you have actually written about hope extensively, no pressure. So I'm going to go into sort of digging that out a little bit more. Hope has become the go-to concept for imagining alternatives in the Anthropocene. Now, I want to caveat this and say that with this, I don't want to engage with frameworks of hope that are still attached to modernist underpinnings. So I'm not looking at sort of humanist, liberal humanist understandings, or even cosmopolitan understandings of hope. Or I'm not really interested in environmental resilience or other liberal endeavors that are kind of still fairly teleologically driven. Instead, I want to engage with critical scholarship across disciplines, particularly those that want to produce speculative engagements with possibilities. Much of this happens from within post-humanism, post-structuralism, decolonial thinking, relational approaches, and therefore implies a fundamental discontent with the onto-epistemological underpinnings of modernity, and obviously seeks to avoid any teleologically driven theorization. Hope does have a liberal humanist baggage to contend with. It does, the notion itself, which is possibly part of the reason I stayed away from the concept as long as I did. But it remains still a powerful concept that occupies much space in critical and radical approaches to the Anthropocene. Perhaps most notably, hope and its negative, the hopelessness that I talked about at the beginning, are central features of approaches that work to unpack the production of the modern subject from the starting point of what is referred to as ontological loss. Work in Black studies here, and particularly Afro-pessimism, has been central in framing refusal as a core theoretical object of thinking about hope in as a critique to modernity. Hope as affirmative and normatively driven action plays little to no role here, and instead is seen, particularly in the guises of emancipation, as a problem, as a way to co-opt Black subjectivities into a system that's predicated on anti-Blackness. In other words, don't just assume that emancipation is going to resolve all the problems that you have seen so far. I'm an international relations scholar. That's where I come from. That's how I sort of got into this, set of literature. And I would flag that I found a recent book by Farai Chipato and David Chandler, who's in the audience today, Race in the Anthropocene, quite helpful to understand how this has played out in my field, and how this particular set of literature deals with this starting point, this sense of hopelessness, this inability to do things after we're done doing things effectively. In the book, and in David's earlier work on hope, and in Valerie's and Paul's as well, the literature, here I'm sort of focusing particularly on David and Farai's book, the literature is understood as a form of sort of the literature to do with this ontological position of loss, as a form of nihilism that tries to engage with the structural violence of white supremacy, the epistemological prioritization of the subject-object relationship, and the limits of the extent to which we could possibly reimagine an outside to modernity. Basically, everything that is wrong with how we think about the future and modernity. Against this set of literature, Farai and David review a range of other literature from pragmatist to speculative, seeking to engage with the question of what's outside modernity and how do you even get to it, even if you wanted to. Hope here is either connected to the ability to foster a sensitivity to this inaccessible beyond, for speculative approaches, kind of re-enchanting yourself to the world, to access this sort of beyond that we haven't seen so far, or to the ability to bring the subject closer to the world, to the existing real of the world, by tapping into the imaginaries of those communities who've already been doing this for millennia, i.e. read indigenous communities, for instance. And those other communities that have knowledge systems that rely on relationality, particularly in their interactions with non-humans. For them, these two strands of literature are still hope affirmative, in that they still try to re-enchant the world or find solutions outside modernity, accepting that another world to come is possible. Against this, Afro-pessimism and other nihilist approaches lament that this is basically a disavowal of anti-Blackness and the role it has in shaping the world and the subject alike, suggesting here that reorienting the subject just tries to give meaning to the subject that doesn't really change the premises of the world or our engagement with it. In other words, we're not really doing anything here in terms of thinking about what is possible. Now, I found this heuristic or taxonomy quite helpful, despite initially not wanting to engage with hope at all, because it tells me a number of different things. It tells me that hope, or talking about hope, despite what I thought before I engaged with it, could be quite political, or could be very political. And that the question here is not what should we be hoping for, but what can we be hoping for? Unlike with the liberal tradition's emphasis on laying out all the possible outcomes, this is scenario A, this is scenario B, this is, utopia A, utopia B, that, all the possible things that the subject could attain. The question here is addressed in an ontological register to account for the fact that some subjects cannot hope, okay? That the object of hope are unattainable to some. I also think this taxonomy is helpful in zooming in on the relationship between loss, and in the Anthropocene we talk about loss a lot, we talk about loss of biodiversity, we talk about loss of culture, we talk about loss of people. So I wanted to explore this a little bit, and this taxonomy is helpful in zooming in on the relationship between loss and affirmation, hopelessness and agency, effectively, if you think back to that opening line that I read. I found that the value was in directing us to Black and queer theorizing and their intersection. And the taxonomy told me, at least, that the question of hope or hopelessness in the Anthropocene is very much a question of how to conduct and operationalize a critique of a dominant social order. Okay, that's what we're all trying to do here. We're trying to sort of saying the dominant social order does not work, hasn't worked, has never worked, will never work. Let's do something about it. And obviously, that's to me, that taxonomy was quite useful in bringing hope and hopelessness, these two sides of the coin, in conversation together. I'm going to quote here, and again, fair warning for F-bombs. If F-bombs offend you, please cover your ears. I'm quoting from Lee Edelman here. Fuck the social order. There's a list of other things that begin with fuck. I'm going to skip to, it's a very long quote. Fuck the whole network of symbolic relations and the future that serves as its prop. These F-bombs, I believe, are exemplary of a call to use hope, not to think about a better future, but to declare that the future stops here with the Anthropocene. So the starting point here is the need to declare the end of the world, an end of the world within which the subject is made or unmade according to a particular dominant logic, that of Western liberal democracy.